I want to share the railway line principle with you. I developed the railway line principle 20 years ago and it served me well ever since, and it will serve you well. But it's complicated to explain, but at the end you'll see it's actually very, very simple. I want you to picture in your mind a railway marshalling yard. So a railway marshalling yard has lots and lots of separate railway lines, and that's what the railway line principle is all about. And so when we're in a meeting, there's a whole range of things that need to be done. So I'm going to move a little bit to give you an understanding of how it works. So the first railway line we're going to be on is the agenda. I call it the agenda railway line. And while you're on the agenda, you obviously don't talk about anything else. Once the meeting starts, you stick to the agenda. The first item on the agenda is the opening and the protocols, the apologies and so on. So let's talk about apologies for just a moment. When we get to the apologies, we move to the apologies railway line. While we're on the apologies, we don't talk about anything else. We just talk about apologies. And I know that's really easy to understand. So it's exactly the same principle as we go on. When we finish with apologies, we're back to the agenda railway line. And now we might have business arising. And so we're back onto a separate railway line called business arising. And while we're on that railway line, we don't talk about anything else except business arising. When that's finished, we're back to the agenda railway line. Then, as we progress, we'll get to perhaps a motion, a main motion or a substantive motion, or in an informal meeting, we'll just get to a suggestion. And so, but let's talk about it in terms of formal meetings because it's a tiny bit easier to explain that way. So we have a main motion. That's a separate railway line. And we talk about the main motion. We don't talk about anything except the main motion. No other motions, no other issues, nothing else that's on the agenda, because those things are back over here on the agenda railway line. But we're not on that railway line. We're on the main motion railway line. And so we proceed along that railway line. Now we may get an amendment. If we do, we're now on another railway line. It is the amendment railway line. It's not the main motion railway line, and it's not the agenda railway line, not main motion, it's the amendment railway line. And so we do nothing but talk about the amendment. Now an amendment is a bit like adding a carriage, or it can be taking a carriage away from the train. And I'm just using that metaphor to link in with the railway lines. So in the amendment, then we are discussing nothing but the amendment. What we don't discuss is the motion. And here's a key understanding. You don't talk about the amendment as if the motion is amended. In other words, you don't talk about the amended motion because it hasn't been amended yet. So we're over on the amendment and all we talk about is the amendment. Now, if that amendment is passed, then we move back to the main motion and that carriage, that amendment, is now added on the end. Or, to make it a little bit more complex, if the amendment was to remove something, then a carriage has disappeared from our main motion train. So here we are now, let's assume that that amendment was carried. Here we are now on the main motion track again with a carriage added. Now there may be a second amendment, and so we now move to another track, and that is the second amendment track. While we're on that railway line, we don't talk about anything except that second amendment. And just like the first one, it's either carried or it's lost. Let's assume that it's carried, and so we move back to the main motion, which has now been amended once. Now it's been amended twice. So there's two carriages on the back of the train, of the main motion train. And so we're on the main motion railway line again. Let's say we have a procedural motion now. A procedural motion may be, let's send this whole issue back to the committee. So we're now back onto another railway line called the procedural motion railway line. And we progress along that line and we talk about nothing else except that procedural motion. We don't talk about the main motion, we talk about only the procedural motion. But to let it be a little more complex and what I think a bit more fun is let's have a point of order. So let's say we're on the procedural motion to move it back to a committee and we get a point of order. Well, the point of order is yet another railway line. We don't talk about anything except that point of order, and only the chair talks about that really, and the person who raises the point of order. And that point of order gets dealt with, and then we come back to the procedural motion. The procedural motion gets dealt with, and then two things could happen with the procedural motion. We could either move back to the main motion, or the procedural motion might finish debate and we actually move all the way back to the agenda. So if you think about the railway lines being simply an issue or an item on the agenda, whatever item you're on, that's a railway line. A train cannot run on two railway lines at the same time. It can only be on one railway line. And so your meeting is exactly the same. Your meeting needs to run with one issue at a time. Don't talk about the other issues. Even though they relate to each other, that all gets put together as you move down and make the decisions about what you're going to do. And you'll eventually get back to the main agenda. So the railway line principle is a really key understanding, and it helps you enormously.